Bayan. And I am excited to introduce our panelists. We have Chaplain Sondos Kholaki, who is a board certified chaplain. She earned an accredited Master's of Divinity degree in Islamic chaplaincy from Bayan. She serves as a hospital chaplain at Hoag Hospital in Irvine and as a chaplain for the Irvine Police Department. She is the author of Musings of Muslim Chaplain and a co-editor of Mantle of Mercy. We have Dr. Kameelah Oseguera, who is the founding executive director of Muslim Wellness Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting healing and emotional well-being in the American Muslim community. She is also the assistant professor of psychology and Muslim studies and the Aspire project director at Chicago Theological Seminary. And we have our moderator, Imam Ahmad Deeb, who is a community professional and earned his accredited MA in Islamic Studies from Bayan. Imam Deeb is the co-founder and teacher of Pillar Seminary and the co-founder and Imam of Shifat Community. And Imam Deeb, I will give it to you now.
All right. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Allah barik fiki. Thank you to Bayan for hosting this critical conversation, more needed maybe than any time, least that I can remember in my lifetime. SubhanAllah, we're really, really happy with all of you here. Thank you for being with us. Inshallah, we pray it's a very fruitful and beneficial conversation. And of course, it's going to be. We have two powerhouses, incredible teachers and scholars with us to talk about a topic that is very, very, very critical, which is about trauma and how to cope with trauma as a community. I'm not going to take too much time, so I want to get right into it. Dr. Kameelah, I wanted to start with you, and I wanted to ask you, before we get into coping with trauma, what is trauma? It's a word that is thrown around a lot, and I believe many are curious as to not only what is its definition, but what are its metrics? How do we define it? What does it feel like? What does it look like in the world? Can you speak to that?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace. Good evening. It's really great to see all of you here. And I think it's a topic that is all at once necessary and difficult to talk about because we see just in, kind of in sort of lay language or just in colloquial language, people say, oh, I've been so traumatized, I'm so triggered. So there's a ways that the words are used and almost it starts to strip away its meaning. And I think that we feel a lot, especially given the genocide that's happening in Gaza, and also bearing witness to ways that this war and this violence is ever present, right? And so if we think just 10 years ago to another instance of war in Gaza 10 years ago, the images that we were able to receive were perhaps delayed by a day and a half. There was a way that we were getting our information not as quickly. And so I think it's important to review a definition of trauma, as well as what might the emotions that that we might feel ourselves going through almost in a cyclical way. I also want to mention in this definition what's called spiritual bypassing, because I think there's a way that Muslims certainly we lean on our faith and to get through these really difficult, volatile, tumultuous moments. And at times we use spirituality to minimize, right, the emotions that we feel. Or to say, I should just simply be grateful, right, that I am safe, that I'm personally safe. And so I should have no complaints. I should not cry. I should not feel ill at ease. And this is sort of a denial of the self that can actually intensify feelings of anger, of hopelessness, of despair. So I want to provide a really intentionally broader definition because we can delve deeper into it, but also highlight some of those feelings and emotions that are associated with what it means for us to bear witness to a traumatic event. So first, thinking about trauma, and some clinicians will call this like trauma, like with a capital T, right? So events that there's universal agreement that when there's an incident or experience which causes either physical or emotional, psychological, or even spiritual harm, and you feel unsafe, you feel threatened, you're sort of unsure about what the long-term impact of that incident might be, or simply experience shock, right? So there are four aspects of a traumatic experience that someone may feel, and this is why it can be subjective, right? That something that I might feel is incredibly immediately traumatic for someone else may not feel that way. So we try to use a broader definition, right, about an incident that can cause these sort of levels of harm, but something that also happens unexpectedly, that we feel unprepared for the event, we feel powerless to prevent it, and it happens repeatedly, right? And so think about this in terms of what we're witnessing in the genocide in Gaza. It happens unexpectedly, right? That we're unprepared and we feel powerless to prevent it, right? And that it keeps happening, right? And so we see these waves of violence, and as we're witnessing, so something can be felt as traumatic even if it's not happening to us physically, right? We're watching, right? Helplessly, powerlessly, to prevent what is sort of a nauseating level of violence. And so seeing those images, the sounds of bombs, and how it might also be related to our personal histories, right? So many Muslims in America may feel very much connected to sort of diasporic communities. And so when we're watching violence happening in one place and it's related to white supremacy, it's related to colonialism, it might be activating parts of ourselves and our own personal histories around displacement. I've talked to folks who say, it's making me think about sort of British colonialism in Southeast Asia, right? That what happened to our grandparents, our great grandparents during partition, right? And feeling like, we're constantly being displaced, um, erased, right? And so when we're thinking about what is happening in the moment, as well as the memories, right, that we feel in our bodies and in our spirits and in our minds, it can become quite overwhelming. So I'll just say briefly some of the symptoms of trauma that we can experience even physically may manifest as numbness, right? Someone says like, well, I'm fine. I don't really feel anything. I'm just upset. I'm angry, right? I'm full of rage. And that level of numbness can turn into apathy, right? But it's a way to sort of protect yourself from, again, the impact of something that feels unexpected and we're unprepared for, and we feel powerless to prevent it as it happens repeatedly. We might feel it in our bodies as not being able to focus, right? As feeling anxious. Some folks might even have like gastrointestinal kind of issues, where I can't keep anything down. I can't eat. I can't sleep. It's difficult. I don't have an appetite anymore. So there's physical manifestations, certainly psychological, when, the sort of the experience of watching something and then, tears coming to your eyes. Perhaps it's also feeling just tremendous sadness, right? And that it might come in waves that are unexpected, right? Like I was just, I don't know, drinking coffee or I was headed to work, and then I just felt like this overwhelming sense of despair. Um, but trauma also impacts us spiritually, right? Where we begin to despair in, if we are truly to believe that, Allah is in control and that we should put our faith in Him, how do I make sense of what is incomprehensible? Right. And so when we feel even sort of anger towards the creator, right? Like someone, right, has to intervene. Why not the most powerful, right? Divine. Where is the intervention? And so we might move from a cycle of rage to disconnection to apathy, to feeling like I'm so overwhelmed, I can't think about this anymore. I don't want to see anything or talk about, what is happening. And then feeling some measure of shame and guilt, right? Is it my Americanness, my privilege, my, distance, right, from the place that even allows me to say, well, I'm just gonna close Twitter and Instagram. I'm not gonna read anything else. And then we feel awful, right? And so these waves of emotion, of physical dis-ease, of sort of spiritual burnout and conflict can be hallmarks of what is being experienced as witnessing, right, a traumatic event, and then what is activating for us in terms of our own personal histories. So I'm gonna stop there. There's so much more to say, but I'll end with this, that of course we believe that Allah is always in control, right? That there is an unfolding story before us, and we have no idea how it's going to end, right? Um, and we can cry, we can feel pain and hurt um, over what is just, again, kind of incomprehensible loss of life and destruction. Um, and not tell ourselves like, well, I shouldn't be sad because, we believe that Allah is great, Allah is greater than all of it. But these emotions we can see as giving us information that we are connected to a global ummah, and not just, again, what's happening in Gaza, but around the world, and in our personal lives. So we have to give ourselves permission to feel those things that we feel. And even if it's not hope, right, for a future that we can't see, it is, these emotions are telling me something that I need to pay attention to and that I need to care for. Because if I'm completely depleted and exhausted and burnt out, I will not be able to, in some small way, advocate for those who do not have a voice in this moment. So I'm going to turn it over to my sister, Chaplain Sondos, to add your thoughts and insights.
So thank you for that, Dr. Kameelah. That was an amazing introduction. I'm glad you mentioned, the importance of feeling emotion. I think people forget that that is a sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that when he was burying his infant child and he started to cry, when people questioned that, because his faith is the faith, he told them, of course I'm going to cry. These tears are a manifestation of God's mercy. So I really appreciated that point. And just before I move on to Chaplain Sondos, something that was very insightful as like a metric was that you mentioned there are 4 aspects to trauma. I think I have unexpected, unprepared for, and then powerless to prevent. I missed the 4th, so I just wanted to.
Yes, and that it happens repeatedly. So I'll use the example of, again, bearing witness to police brutality. Folks, might say, there's another hashtag, right, representing the loss of life of someone who is now, murdered and killed at the hands of law enforcement. We should never feel like, well, why am I angry? Of course this happens in America, right? Of course this happens when we're talking about a settler colonial state. Why am I angry? Why am I sad? There's a clip that was shared a few days ago, Toni Morrison. She said, I always want to be surprised, right? I always want to feel anger because that lets me know that I'm human, right? I never want to get to the point where I feel like, well, of course there's a loss of life. It's tragic, it's sad, but we shouldn't react, so in such a volatile way. We shouldn't feel so angry. And I disagree, right? Every instance, every loss of life should leave us feeling shocked and surprised and devastated, and filled with a sense of there's divine justice that we don't know, right, is perhaps just on the horizon. So let us be shocked and surprised and outraged, right, with every instance, and then manage the emotions that come up because of that.
That's an amazing point. I don't hear often, and forgive me, I have just one follow-up question to that. Is it because I do encounter this a lot. actually. I in my work as an imam and beyond, there are people who are just like, well, this is nothing new. What do you expect? Why do you want my whole life to stop for something like this? And I heard, one scholar said, yes, we do. We want part of your life to stop because of what's happening. So my question is, do you think that people, this desensitization, maybe, is it a byproduct of not listening to those emotions or not processing those potentially traumatic experiences?
I think it might be some measure of a little bit of both, right? That I think primarily it is, I would say, a way to protect ourselves from those things that feel out of our control, right? And so if I am detached, if I dissociate from it a bit, if I say, well, of course, what do we expect when we're dealing with, right, this level of violence? Then it helps us feel like we're in control of something, right? I'm in control of myself. I won't be shocked or surprised. I will simply be outraged, right? And that's, I think, ways that we try to protect our psyches, perhaps in not the healthiest way. But these are, again, if we're opening our hearts to what is happening, um, to Muslims in China, to Muslims in Sudan, what's happening in Congo, if we open ourselves up, right, and to be aware of all of those instances in which we have no control, it can feel really overwhelming and exhausting. Um, and when we simply sit in a place of sort of outrage and anger, though that feels like a more powerful emotion, right? It feels
Mm,
like more activating, more energizing, whereas sadness makes me feel weak, right?
mm,
Despair makes me feel like impotent in a way. So I think we're all struggling to find a way to um, protect ourselves, and in order to think about the healthier ways to cope is simply to acknowledge that this range of emotion was given to us by the creator, right?
mm,
So let's not deny it. Let's sort of identify what it is, and think about how we need support as a community, right?
mm.
To adjust to all of the ways that the world feels upside down.
Mm. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant response. Chaplain Sondos, in your line of work, you obviously encounter much of the same themes. One of or two maybe of the themes that I wanted you to kind of address through your expertise is you see a lot of grief, as a hospital chaplain. And from my little knowledge, you also see that tied to the despair, the theological despair that people feel in this moment. And you encounter a lot of the theodicy questions. And I know that, like, anywhere I've given any lecture or program, that's the question that everyone is asking. How do I reconcile this theologically while dealing with this grief? I wanted you to speak to that, and of course the topic more broadly.
Of course. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Just thank you to the Bayan team once again, and to my fellow panelist, Dr. Kam. Such a pleasure to learn from you again. And Imam Ahmad, always a pleasure to share virtual space with you. So it's interesting. I was thinking about a patient that I had recently who was in the hospital, and she was a younger mother and dying of cancer, unfortunately. It was in her last days and last moments. And I was sitting outside in the waiting room with her son, probably early 20s, Muslim family. And he was crying, and he was asking me, Chaplain, what's going to happen now? And I thought he was asking about kind of like the death process. And I started to explain. He said, no, I'm talking about grief. How long am I going to grieve for? Could you tell me some stories of like other people who are in my position exactly, where they're losing a parent? Like, what do they do? And what does that look like? What does it feel like? Really kind of approaching this anticipatory grief, like anticipating that he's going to be going down this road, is already starting that process of it. But I got this feeling of like trepidation, of fear.
And whenever we talk about grief, this is something that continues to come up, especially within our community, is like, I don't want to feel pain. I don't want to feel discomfort. I don't really want to do the whole grieving process. So is there a way to like skip it and get around it? What do I expect, right? So I think beginning with what Dr. Ken was talking about, this permission to feel and this understanding that we don't actually have to really do anything, because grief is a natural reaction to loss. When you read kind of that textbook definition, I focus on this natural reaction. And I liken it to those of us who have had the honor of giving birth. So when you have, and grief is also related in this way when people talk about it, is like this contraction, like you breathe through the contraction. Your body is doing it. You really don't have any control over it. What you are in charge of is finding ways to get through that wave and through that moment. And a lot of people practice breathing, they do prayer. So very similarly, when we're in this process of grief, give permission to for our bodies to be able to feel everything that we feel. And that really is the way to get through it. And I love the hadith that you brought up, and the story from the Prophet ﷺ, from his life, where he's holding his infant son, Ibrahim, and as he was dying in his arms, Allahumma salli alayhi, and crying. And his response to his companions, who were kind of taken aback by the amount of crying that he was doing, and asked them, oh, you too, Rasulullah, like you're expressing this grief. And he says, his reaction is, and this is really the template for me that I go by, and I hope that this is kind of an easy way for people to understand this, moving into the theodicy, the theology of suffering. He says that tears are a mercy, right? And we'll break this down. Tears are a mercy, but we do not say that which displeases Allah. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, right? So there are two elements that the Prophet ﷺ always so eloquently and in such few words is delivering a real powerhouse of a message and kind of instruction and a guide for us. Number one, tears are a mercy. How many of us have had a good cry in the last 9 weeks? I'm talking about like ugly cry. Right? And what do we feel after we have that ugly cry? There is an absolute release. And when we think about the somatic research that's done on this, like 1400 years later, we're talking about the science of being able to cry and the stress hormones. I mean, I'm not a scientist, so like, all the hormones that decrease and the good ones that increase, and just this release, if we want to think about it, it is an actual rahmah for our bodies. So allowing that to go and having a good cry. And we'll know for ourselves, like when I haven't had a good cry in a few weeks in this whole period, and it comes, I was like, oh man, I needed that. I didn't even realize how much I needed that to be able to kind of pick up and move on. And then the second half around, but we don't say that which is displeasing to Allah. That gives us a nice, clear framework and limits and boundaries within which we have to explore kind of the mindset for how we're approaching grief. So we keep a good opinion of Allah, which is what Dr. Khan was referring to. We know that there is divine justice. We understand that Allah is in control. We understand that there's a bigger story that is playing out. And there's so much to say around this. But I think for our community and what I see at the hospital over and over again with the questioning, and I want to pause on this point, because I don't want us to come away from this to think that questioning or asking questions about what's going on is a form of lack of faith or disbelief. And I go back to the verse in the Quran where the believers and the prophets among them ask, when is the help of Allah coming? Mata Nasrullah. And it's really interesting that Allah Ta'ala uses the term believers, not lack of belief or disbelievers. These are believers asking this question. And when we hear that question coming from them in a place where they were, cut off from food, cut off from resources, and really like, we know the help of Allah is coming, but we're just like, where is the help of Allah? In that question is that attempt at meaning making. And so when people are asking questions, it's not necessarily a reflection of like, I don't believe this or I don't know what to believe, but I'm just trying to bring everything that I've ever been taught about suffering, about pain, about crisis, about why do bad things happen to good people, all of those kind of existential questions, and put it right here in front of me and ask, okay, I know this maybe theoretically, but it's never really been put to the test. I've never seen it played out. I've never had to experience kind of the whole, the holistic mind, body, and soul being disrupted by this event happening to me. So now I'm just bringing all of that information that I had theoretically and putting it against my experience and saying, do they align and do they match up? And so you'll hear people. So I heard in your question too that people will say, like, I know this is true and I accept it and I surrender completely, then why am I still crying? Then why am I still having trouble sleeping? And it's like, we have to understand that in grief, there's going to be a period of time where there's going to be a little bit of misalignment or disconnect between the heart and the mind. And that's okay. And that's normal. And that's what the process of grief is about, is that you go through this process until you come back to equilibrium. Equilibrium is like, okay, what I believe spiritually is lining up with what I'm experiencing, and like I'm regaining this kind of wholeness and this perspective. And we can talk about, the different ways to do that, and I will unpack that, inshallah. The last thing I'll say is that the grief, especially that comes out of the current crisis, I have found really interesting, because I keep going back to this image of like two streams of grief. And I don't know if this resonates with Dr. Kam, with yourself and others, but I feel like there are two simultaneous streams of grief happening for me. Number one is this like grief surrounding the obvious loss of life and the destruction and the suffering that we're witnessing over and over in Gaza. And then there's this other stream that is around this kind of bewilderment and shock at humanity's response. So I've talked to people who have said, I've lost friends, people who I've known for decades, like our children grew up together, and over this issue, like our friendship has dissolved. There's nothing, and they're tearful. They're losing family, they're losing friends. Some people are losing their jobs. Masks are falling off, right? Kind of those of us who have not been subjected to racism, bigotry in its like purest form are now seeing it come up in neighbors, in workplaces. And so there's this feeling of just like Dr. Kam said, there's this threat to security and to safety. And there's a lot of fear around there coming from that grief, and a lot of anger as well. Like, where's the justice of people? And then there's this other realm of grief coming around, which is all about that sadness, because it's the loss of life, it's the destruction of an entire people, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of layers to this, and that might be attacking us all at once. But I will pause here, and we can continue on that line of theology in the next part, inshallah.
All right, that was amazing. I will come back to your definition of equilibrium. I love that so much, that what I believe spiritually is linking up to how I feel, and that's not always going to be the case. And I think one of the things that we're learning from Dr. Kameelah's point as well is that we have to give ourselves space to recognize that I may not be in this state of ideal equilibrium, and that isn't a lack of faith. That isn't even potentially deficient faith. That's being a human being, right? Barakallahu fikum. Okay, so Dr. Kameelah, I want to shift to you, and I want you to walk us through. Okay, we understand what trauma is. We understand how it manifests. We've even talked about its various kind of forms, but what can we do at an individual level and at a communal level to actually cope with those feelings or that sense of trauma?
Well, first I wanted to say, Chaplain Sondos, that the sort of the parallel or the layers of grief that we're experiencing, I think is so important to identify. And in particular, as a community of American Muslims, in which we try so hard to be good, right? Like we have to be stoic, we have to be resilient, we have to be kind and generous, right? And at times, that feeling of pressure around how we present ourselves place barriers to us really connecting with the true emotion that we experience. We should be experiencing rage. That is also a very natural reaction to injustice. But because of some external pressure, it's Islamophobia, it's our own sort of spiritual orientation. We want to sort of present kind of a collective image of a community, of a people who will always surrender to the qadr of Allah, right? We never question it. We never sort of struggle and feel conflicted about it. But if our most revered prophets were conflicted, we can be as well, right? And I think it's important to emphasize what you said, that meaning making is a result of us trying to develop a coherent story, right? And this is the way that we learn, the way that we grow, the way that we try to fit in, again, the incomprehensible. I need a story, right? And often the story is something along the lines of, there's a villain, there's a protagonist, right? The good person wins, right? The hero walks off into the sunset. So we want a coherent story that can help us feel a sense of peace and of contentment, and to really reach that level of equilibrium. Things feel balanced, right? The world is now balanced in a way that I understand. But when we have these moments of upheaval, right, we're trying to say, okay, wait, how does this fit within the narrative of, good prevails, right? When we see, again, repeatedly, how can one country veto a ceasefire? What is happening, right? And so we're trying to, in that meaning making, part of it is sort of stretching our own minds and our spirits to absorb information that doesn't fit, right? And so we may be not in the question of where is Allah, right? It's not a denial that Allah is present, but where? I need for my own heart to see some example, some manifestation, right, of God's presence, because I'm crumbling, right? I'm falling apart and I need a sign. And so when we hear at times the anger and the deep anguish, right, around the question, the existential question of where's Allah, it is someone, I think, crying out for meaning, right? That not that I've veered into a state of complete disbelief, but that I need a sign. And at times the sign is the care, right, from our community, and the permission that says, I feel the same. I am really struggling right now, right? And so when we think about what is helpful in these moments, it is truly the presence of others and community. Because one thing that trauma and some of the symptoms that go along, whether it's depression or anxiety, can isolate us, right? Can cause us to withdraw from others because we can't make sense of anything, and we feel really vulnerable in that state. It is also a sense of what you mentioned, Sondos, like a sense of betrayal, right? Like there's um, with those close relationships where we now find this vast gap, right? And what I thought you believed and how I thought you would show up, there's a sense of betrayal, again, that is hard to identify because we don't want to personalize it, right? People are dying and I'm upset because I lost a friend, right? This is how we diminish, right, some of the really personal impacts. But what I've said is that there might be many relationships that we have that might be a casualty of this war, right? And so it's not just to, sort of make ourselves the center of the universe, but to really be present to what is being lost, and the concept of disenfranchised grief, right? In that we're grieving a war, a genocide, experiences for which there is not universal condemnation, right? And in fact, to even speak, right? And I am so thankful, alhamdulillah, that I am for the most part in spaces where I can talk about the grief that I feel, right, of being in Palestine when the war started, of now witnessing home, and fear about people's lives. And, if I check my messages in the morning, will someone have died overnight? Like, I can talk about those things, but it is not, it may not be the case for everyone that they can go to work and say, I only got 2 hours of sleep because I cried, because I found out someone died, right? This is the disenfranchised grief, means that there is stigma attached to the loss, stigma related to saying free Palestine. If I say free Palestine, someone will say I'm calling for the genocide of Jewish people, right? And so now you're putting a level of grief and betrayal and anguish on hold to explain, right, what you mean, or to correct or to apologize. And so when we're confronted by an experience in which, again, I'll use the example of police brutality. Someone will say, well, what was that person doing that caused them to be killed at the hands of a police officer? Right? This is disenfranchised grief. There's so much stigma attached to it. And so we're dealing with so many layers of the traumatic incident itself, the reactions that we have, the ways that we're trying to make meaning, right? And the event is still happening, right? We're not doing sort of a post-war conversation. We're in the middle of it, right? And so if we make space for the ways that our emotions shift, right? I mean, I know I've personally experienced some days where I am like very certain, right? There will be a free Palestine. Allah, I beg you that Palestine is free in my lifetime, right? I'm very certain about that. And there are other days that I'm just speechless, right? How is this still happening? And so if we, instead of resisting, right, the sort of the shifts and the ebbs and flow of what we feel, but just to kind of be open, right, to what that flow is and what it's telling us. One, I'm still human. I still care, right? There are things that are still important to me about my community of believers and about humanity. But we will experience something of that, those tears being mercy, when we either don't deny or resist, right? Kind of like allow yourself to feel, right? And know that if anything is guaranteed, it is that everything changes. Right? That is the only, sort of degree of certainty, or, one of several, is that everything will change. And so this moment that I'm having, can I allow myself to be present for the tears, for the anger, for the pain? And then perhaps you have that friend that will send you the most random, inappropriate, hilarious meme, right? And you find yourself laughing at a cat dressed up, I don't know, it's like, something crazy. But saying like, I needed the tears to even reconnect with myself, right? And I can still laugh, right? There are people who are experiencing a profound level of suffering who are also smiling, right? And that might seem incongruent, right? But we've all, and I can say this with some degree of certainty, we've all experienced loss, right? Allah tells us this. And at the same time, we've been able to laugh. We've been able to really smile at the memory of something, that really touched us. And these things aren't mutually exclusive. And the healing that we are able to approach, I think the most powerful form of that is in community, right? Is creating space for each other, of being able to say, I was a mess yesterday. I feel a little bit better today. I'm not sure what tomorrow's going to look like, but please make dua for me, right? Or check on me, right? Ask me, where's your heart today? Where, on a scale of 1 to 10, right? Where's your mind? Where's your spirit? And what has been helpful, right? And being able to sit in the moments of sadness, knowing, again, that this will pass, right? But I have to sort of weather the moment that I'm in, and then we'll reach, again, sort of a different moment, and perhaps I'll feel more strength because of the presence of others. So I'll stop there, but I think we should, if everyone can do this, is kind of what I say is diagnostic, right? Like do an assessment of what are the layers of grief that are present, right,
Mm.
in your own life, in this moment,
Mm.
right? And so while we're witnessing war and violence, perhaps there are some of us who are struggling with, economic uncertainty. We're struggling with the loss of relationship, whether that be a friendship or romantic. We're struggling with perhaps estrangement, right, from others. So our lives are still running parallel, right, to those events that seemed really, huge and top of mind. We still have our lives that are, forcing us to confront how we must hold multiple events at once.
Mm. Barakallah fiki. Thank you so much, Dr. Kameelah. Chaplain Sondos, same question. How can individuals and communities cope with the trauma that we're all experiencing?
I'll focus again sort of on the meaning making aspect, since that's what I do with community and in the hospital, and just kind of go back to that point. There is all this talk around coping with like how we think about or make meaning out of or give purpose to our pain and our suffering and the trials and tests that come our way. This is a really popular sort of like healing modality, this idea of, do you have a growth mindset? Do you view challenges and pain and discomfort as an opportunity for one to grow in certain ways? And it's really interesting for us to note that the emotion itself, there's a study that said something like the emotion itself lasts for like 90 seconds, but it's the narrative, what Dr. Kameelah is talking about, that we form around the emotion in our head that keeps replaying, that will set the tone for the rest of the processing. So how we think about, and what they refer to this as in the field of chaplaincy, is one's theology of suffering. In other words, what are your beliefs around suffering? So these, again, existential questions. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God test us with these sort of things? When I talk to like youth or kids as young as, upper elementary and middle school, I'll bring this up to say, if you don't have an answer to that question yet, now is the time to formulate it. Because when you can formulate some kind of framework through which you can understand the things that are going to be happening in this dunya around us, which is at its essence unjust and painful and unbalanced, and is the realm of trial and test, as told to us by Allah Ta'ala, the better it is that we can kind of take those answers and grasp them. When we have nothing, when we're kind of like at zero and something happens and we're trying to formulate a framework and come up with the answers in the moment, it's really, really difficult to, because our emotions are so present. It's hard to kind of think clearly, linearly, logically, spiritually, all of that. So I want to emphasize again, if folks have not yet thought about their answers to those questions, and so when I'm sitting with someone and they'll say like, I keep making dua, but nothing's happening. So what's the point? Or what's the point of making dua if like Allah already has a plan? And, like Imam Ahmad, you've heard these questions before, I'm sure. And so rather than directly answering them, I'll say, it sounds like you have, some questions still around this topic. So where do you usually go when you're looking for answers? For some people, it's, my favorite sheikh, maybe on YouTube, or somebody within my masjid. For some people, it's, stories of the Quran. For some people, it's the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. For some people, it's my grandmother, who is very wise and has lived through a lot. And so there's this exploration, and like one for all of us to think about, well, for myself, when I have a question that relates to religion, to spirituality, who or what is it that I approach in order to get those answers, who I trust and who I feel like has that balanced approach? And if one doesn't do it for you, I'll tell people, if you go to your favorite sheikh or whoever, and they give you an answer that they've already figured out for themselves and they're good with, and it doesn't quite settle or resonate with you, keep going. Go to the next person, ask them what they think. Because guess what? Every single person is going to come up with a slightly different, maybe not answer, but perspective on the issue that for whatever reason gives them that peace and that comfort and that balance. It may not be the same for you because of what Dr. Cam talked about earlier, is that this will bring up different things for different people, right? According to what our bodies have experienced or have gone through in the past. And so the theology is really important around that. The last thing I'll mention, just because of time, that I go back to is dua of Musa alayhi salam. So we all know it. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. And then there's this additional part that we kind of leave out. So, Lord, expand for me my chest, untie the knot from my tongue, allow people to understand my speech or receive it. And then also, send with me my brother Harun. And so there are two, again, elements to this prayer that I'd like to bring for people's attention or to reflect on is, number one, you notice that Musa alayhi salam, when he's tasked with confronting Fir'aun, and like if we give ourselves a moment to just think about the heaviness of this task and how absolutely frightened and scared Musa was and how much courage he needed, right? When we look at exactly what it is that he's praying for or asking Allah for, he's not focusing on the outcome. He's not saying, Ya Allah, make me victorious against Fir'aun. He's asking Allah Ta'ala to strengthen within him personal qualities or characteristics or tools that he needs in order to get through the trial and the test that's in front of him. Plus, I need a helper. I need community, right? Going back to that idea of community, what we're going for. So I'd like to kind of reframe. So when I get this question around, I'm making dua, but I feel like Allah's not listening to me, I'll say, well, let's break down this idea of dua. Tell me, what does dua mean to you, right? What have we been taught about prayer and dua? Is it transactional, kind of like a vending machine? I put my dua in, I get my outcome. And then if it doesn't happen, I have to like kick the vending machine a few times and get my change back. Or is it a vehicle through which, this idea of like taslim or surrender, where we're leaving the outcome to Allah Ta'ala, but we're asking Allah, like, Ya Allah, I need patience. Because I feel like all of us are in such awe of the people of Gaza. And we've seen the clips of the mothers and the grandfathers and the kids and the fathers and everybody on the ground who like they're in the moment that they're being tested, they're saying with absolute conviction these beautiful spiritual truths. And you hear them saying it, and it's like, that's not spiritual bypassing. Like they're feeling everything, and you feel it in their words, but they're adding to it and reminding themselves almost like, this is my framework, and here's how I'm understanding everything that's happening to me. And I'm feeling all that emotion because they've done that work. Whoever it is in their community, there are a lot of them, mashallah, are hafad al-Quran. A lot of them have done this work or maybe seen this over and over again, where they've developed for themselves answers that they can fall back on right away in the moment. It's like that spiritual muscle memory, right? They've exercised that muscle so much, it's just like almost instantaneous. And I think for a lot of us, especially growing up in the West, where we're perhaps not as exposed to that much discomfort and pain and death just all around us all the time. And this fear of like, am I going to make it to the next day? And I'm not just talking about the last 9 weeks, 10 weeks. I'm talking about decades, right? Generations upon generations. This idea of patience. So for myself, first and foremost, this reminder of like when Allah tells us in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, I believe ayah 154 or 155, where he's telling us, like, you will be tested with a series of different losses, a loss of wealth and lives and souls and property, but glad tidings to the patient. It's patience that we need a lot of times, because until Allah's plan kind of unfolds, and we don't know how long that's going to take. And I think about, and I'll end with this, my favorite story to kind of bring up as kind of homework for people who have not yet really come to terms with coming up with these answers for themselves around why do things happen in the world. I love the story in Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18, of Musa and Al-Khidr, where Musa is following Al-Khidr, who's this like spiritual guide and mentor, through those 3 occurrences that happen. And each time, what does Khidr say to him? You're not going to be patient. This word comes up again and again. You're not going to be patient with what you see. And Musa sees and witnesses these atrocities over and over. And it's only at the end that Al-Khidr is like, I told you weren't going to be patient. So let me explain to you what it is that was happening, and gives us this like tafsir and this explanation and breakdown of each event. But if you think about each event, some of them take years and decades for the reality and the truth to be able to come out. Al-Khidr just kind of summarizes it for Musa. Again, this idea of like, you're not going to be able to wait. And so we ask Allah Ta'ala to increase us in patience, to increase us in like that immediate surrender and understanding, and ask Allah for those things. Ask Him to instill and amplify those qualities in ourselves and in the people in Palestine, inshallah, who are so much so our teachers in these times.
Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. MashaAllah. Amazing. Thank you both. That was an incredible exposition of the topic. And before we go into the Q&A, I kind of want to do like a rapid fire 1-minute response to one hopefully easy question. Inshallah, I promise it's gonna be easy. But both of you so eloquently described kind of both the individual and the collective task of building certain muscles and techniques in understanding and coping with trauma at a just on the ground kind of practical level with communities. What is at least one really important thing that you think mosque communities and beyond should be doing to support their congregates or members of their third space or what have you in a time like this? Dr. Kameelah, we'll start with you if that's okay.
You said easy question, Imam. I would say normalizing the range of emotion, that we do not at this point even have to have an explanation. I think we seek those things again to feel like we have some measure of control, but being able to validate that, folks are feeling so many things and it's overwhelming, and that's okay, right? Can we give ourselves permission to sit with the uncertainty, right? And what does that uncertainty teach us? Can we sit with simply acknowledging this is painful, full stop, this is painful, and not going into or feeling pulled to offer someone a solution in the moment, right? Perhaps the test is for us to learn something through this discomfort that can help us in the future. And so I would say normalizing the pain, the range of emotion, and resisting the urge to solve it, right, in order to regain control.
MashaAllah, that's see. I guess it was easy. I guess it was super easy. All right, Chaplain Sondos, your turn. MashaAllah.
I think so often we look to our masajid and our leaders to give us that space, but what I'm quickly learning is that there aren't very many of them, and there are a lot of us who need it. And so to be able to offer that to one another, and when we're talking about community can also be a room of 2 people or a conversation just between 2 people. And so I know there's like a saying where if you're looking for somebody to sit and listen to your problems or your discomforts and issues, you're not going to find very many. But if you are the one to offer that to somebody else, then you will find many people. And so this idea of like, can we do this sort of prophetic witnessing to one another along the lines of what Dr. Kameelah was saying, to be able to hold space for one another, to check on one another in the masjid community, to check on our imams as well, and to check on our chaplains and our professors and the people who are working tirelessly day and night. And so in that way, I feel like it also gives us agency as community members to be able to do that for one another. And it's not that scary. I know people are really scared, like, will I say the wrong thing? Will I do the wrong thing? All I'm asking us to do is just listen in the way that Dr. Kameelah, like just giving ourselves permission to feel, to question, to say those things, and just being that witnessing presence, inshallah.
MashaAllah, I'm amazed that, in 50 2 minutes, we were able to pack in so much on one of the most, complex and important subjects. It's a testimony to the brilliance of both of you. Again, thank you for being here, and thank you to the Bayan team for facilitating this. For those who have questions, you can send them to me privately, as I mentioned before. I didn't get any private questions so far. So for those who want to raise their hand, you can go ahead and raise your hand. My only request, humble and gentle request, is ask a question. Your comments are actually essential, and inshallah, maybe we'll do healing circles to actually hear what you have to offer the conversation, because I do believe there's value in that. But we also want to honor the time of our experts. And so, ask a question. If you have a comment, put it in the chat. We do want to hear what you think. And then when you ask that question, try to make it brief, inshallah, so that we can make room for others who also have questions. Okay, FQ. Bismillah, floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
So like, I've been feeling extremely guilty for, whatever that's going on. And it's like, I see like the videos and everything, I can't see them anymore. Like I just can't, like it's impossible for me to view those. It just does something to me. And so I want to know, like, can I just, like, I want to make dua for them, but I don't know, like, I mean, how, like, or what, like, what to recite, or like, what to even, like, make dua for. Because it's just, I mean, it's crazy what's going on. So
MashaAllah.
I just want to know, like, what dua we should make, and like, yeah, like, just what dua we should make. Like, what's the best dua to make for them?
MashaAllah. Well, first of all, we love you. Thank you for your vulnerability. We can feel the pain in your voice, and that's a sign of a functional, beautiful heart. May Allah bless you. It's an amazing question. If I may, I want to layer this, if it's okay, and I'd love both of your responses to this. The first layer that I think is really important is that, like, when can we just turn off in coping with that guilt? When can we just say, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep watching those videos. What's the, like, metric by which we can, like, have that conversation with ourselves? And then, of course, the second question, which we're hearing, is, what is a good dua for a time like this? Whichever one of you would like to start.
One, just gratitude for the question, and I believe that the emotion certainly resonates with a lot of folks here. I would say, really striving for balance. I think, again, the narrative that we use in our minds to explain our behavior can either intensify, right, the feeling of despair, or again, make room, right, to give ourselves permission. So if you're doing something like, this is the way that I bear witness, I won't turn away. And if I do so, it means I'm a bad human, right? That's going to be counterproductive to your desire to witness, right? Because we are all, we don't have infinite capacity to witness, right, suffering and violence. And so perhaps there are other ways that you can think about to stay connected, but also honor that you are someone with, emotion and feeling, and it can be very overwhelming. And so if it's kind of like a doom scroll, right? Like, if I turn away, then something awful will happen, right? What is the narrative, right? What is the core belief that you are tapping into, which says, it's all or nothing, right? Either I view 100% or I turn away and I feel guilty. The second part of that question, what do I am a sincere believer in communicating as sincerely, though it might feel clumsy, with the Creator, right? And so saying, and really crying out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and saying, I don't know what to say, Allah, right? But I am with you. I am seeking your guidance and your clarity and your compassion and your mercy, that I am feeling so distraught by what is happening. And words fail me, right? And so if we truly believe that Allah loves us, right? Talk to Allah like he is your dearest friend, right? We don't always know the most eloquent, and I think Muslims do this really beautifully, right? We have such eloquent and poetic du'as that we make and that we reach for. But in these moments where we really feel the rawness of what's happening, bring that vulnerability and that pain and that anguish to Allah and speak in the words that come to mind. And that way, again, we give ourselves permission to be in the moment that we're feeling while also drawing Allah closer to us.
MashaAllah. I appreciate that point so much because as an imam, everyone's like, what dua do I make? And it's a very important question. And usually I tell them, like, I'm in this with you. Like I'm just talking to Allah. Like I don't always remember like this prophetic and I actually usually tell people that it's many times better to just talk as a free flow with Allah as opposed to just configuring a relationship with God that's leaning on these ad'iyah that we memorize, which may lack some of that emotion that we need to express. Chaplain Sondos, is there anything that you wanted to? Okay, mashallah, mashallah. Dear brother, I hope that was a sufficient. I mean, I know it was a sufficient answer. If there's any follow-ups, let us know. Barakallah feek. We have Muna S. Floor is yours.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, I actually just wanted to follow up with a suggestion for FQ, just as something that I did earlier. Since this whole thing has started, it's been all about private grief, and just trying to find these moments of grieving in private. I'm a mom, I have 2 kids, husband, very busy life. So it's hard to sometimes just take a moment and even process these things. And something I did actually today, subhanAllah, just differently. I was praying Asr with my 2 girls. And then before we even started, we just made like dua together. We're like, all right, let's just do free form dua just for Palestine and for the kids and everything. And it wasn't just me making the dua. Like I made a dua, but then I turned to my daughters and I was like, okay, what do you want to pray for? What do you want to make dua for? And we just did it together. And although I feel like for the last, couple of months, I've been seeking these moments to grieve in private, I realized that grieving collectively and just explicitly, like with my kids, was really comforting. So all this to say, FQ, maybe if you collectively grieve and make dua, that maybe that might be helpful.
Do any of you want to respond to this, inshallah? Dr. Kameelah? No? Okay. Well, I mean, I as you were talking, I had a thought that I think is very important for maybe us to reflect on. Like, we have a tradition throughout Islamic history and every single Muslim land throughout Islamic history of group dhikr, which really was a form of collective grieving. And if I lived in Cape Town, South Africa, and they have, for me, the most beautiful tradition of this I've ever witnessed. And one of the things that I found so amazing is that during the protests, they're singing the same songs of dhikr, of remembrance and dua, hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. And it's a way of reaffirming for each other, hey, this is our narrative here. This is our meaning making. So I'm just really happy to see that you're doing that. And I pray that more and more people kind of take that initiative as well, inshallah. All right. I believe, Saad, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much. I mean, the panel is great. So heartwarming to hear that there's a Muslim group talking about grief, and this gives a lot of hope. I just have a personal question regarding, being a medical doctor and having to get to see a lot of patients. There's something called, there's a scholar called Kubler-Ross who talks about the 5 stages of the grieving process too, where the person goes through the first stage is the denial, when the person is in a shock, when the event and a scenario happens. And the second is anger, where where the emotions are not in control, and there's, urge of hate or anger of why this is happening. And then there's a third stage of bargaining, and then there's a depression which sets in, and the fifth stage is acceptance. And I was wondering, do Islamically we have any analogies to compare this with? So, in the process, we could connect this psychology tools with Islamic understanding.
So I'll start with Chaplain Sondos simply because we've had this exact conversation, I think, a while back. And I know it's on the
We
forefront.
did. I'm gonna try and pull it up and see if it's online, but I remember that Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. I think it was Dr. Rami from the Bay Area, who's a palliative care doctor. When he does his presentations on end of life for masajid, he brings in a beautiful relation between the stages of grief and setting them against the reaction of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu upon finding out the death of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that you can actually see in real time in the seerah that each of his reactions align with those 5 stages, which I found absolutely fascinating. I think he has that somewhere online. I'll try and find it and link it, inshallah, in a moment. But I think the only point that I'll say about those 5 stages and what we understand of them is that they're not linear per se, and we don't kind of check one off and then move into the next one and never go backwards again, but kind of looks all like this. So we can be in one and then be in one the next day, kind of what Dr. Kem was talking about. Each day feels a little bit different. And there's this also, what I'm reminded of when you bring up the stages of grief is this beautiful poem by Jalaluddin Rumi, who is a theologian and a poet. And he has this beautiful poem called The Guest House, where he brings up this idea of like our bodies being host and our hearts and souls being host to every single emotion that comes in, and treating it like a guest. Like that hospitality theme, I think, resonates for all of us as Muslims. And like, how would you host sadness, and how would you host that bargaining, and how would you host the rage? Because each one of them is there to teach us something about ourselves and our relationship with the Creator. So those are the 2 kind of concepts that come to mind almost immediately. And then, of course, all of the encouragement in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, where he felt all of those things. And I think it's really important for us to understand that the Prophet ﷺ experienced pretty much every form of loss that a human being could experience. And that's obviously intentional because our Creator is intentional. And what a lot of people have expressed to be helpful, both with kind of finding meaning in what they're going through, but also a model, because Allah Ta'ala tells us that in the Prophet ﷺ is the perfect and excellent model, but also reestablishing a connection with the Prophet ﷺ that is personal. It's like, I'm reading that he's going through this and I'm going through it right now. Here's how he's dealing with it. And like, that's how I want to be able to deal with it at some point in time, even though it might not be there yet. But like, wow, the Prophet ﷺ actually went through this, right? And having that more personal of a connection with him. So those are just some ideas that come to mind, inshallah. And I'll pause so I can find the slides for you of those stages.
Sounds great. Dr. Kameelah, would you like to chime in?
I think Chaplain Sondos mentioned this, but that we give ourselves permission to be fallible, to be imperfect. Again, sort of we desperately want to feel that we're resolving, right? Sort of closing all of these tabs, right? I was sad yesterday, close that tab, I'm okay today, right? Because it feels unfinished, right? But this is also what we learn of life, that there are things for which we have no explanation. And that is when our faith sort of steps in, right? To say, we may not know, these are answers we may not ever get, right? Where is there sort of acceptance and not agreement, right? But that there is acceptance in the power and the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we're I think wanting a very neat kind of orderly resolution to the messiness of life, right? The question that we might ask ourselves is why, right? Why must it be resolved right now? Why must we feel like that is yesterday, this is today, I am no longer impacted by that, or I am stronger and sort of impervious to those things? So I think being curious about our own inclinations, especially in moments like this, what am I reaching for? Right? Perhaps is opening up a wound of instability and uncertainty and of hurt that might be decades old, right? And it's sort of resurfacing. And so if we give ourselves a moment to be curious about our own reactions, like why is this overwhelming for me right now, right? Can I understand that? Am I okay with, I feel pain today, and to the point maybe that it's difficult for me to focus. Can I just pause and say, this task will not get done today, right? Can I give myself permission to be human, to be imperfect, to be feeling, and perhaps in that rest, in that pause, right, and in that prayer, I feel a little bit better able, right, to meet the challenge of a different day. And so I would encourage us all to think about how we can be kind to ourselves, how we can be a little bit more gentle, and not in a rush to resolution, when in that rush we might actually overlook those things that we might gain that can help us in the future.
Mashallah, I couldn't have made dua for a better closing closing remarks. But we are out of time. We're actually over time. We want to thank our beloved teachers for being here with us. Before we do end, are there any final notes, closing remarks that Dr. Kameelah, you or Chaplain Sondos want to kind of give us? Even though I just said those were like the perfect closing remarks, but then I felt bad and I was just like, I gotta also ask, or I'm a horrible moderator if I don't.
I would say just be gentle, right? Be gentle. Think about the things or the words that you do not have, that you are desperately seeking, and just make space for the ways that the suffering that we're witnessing, that we're experiencing, is overwhelming. It is incomprehensible. It is exhausting. So if we feel exhausted, if we feel overwhelmed, that is a natural reaction to what is. That we can be gentle in allowing ourselves to be in because the moments that we're in are the only moments we have, right? We at times take for granted that there's a thought that we will wake up in the morning, right? Or maybe I'll continue to advocate tomorrow. But the moments that we're in, that we can show mercy and compassion and gentleness with ourselves, we then have a greater capacity to extend that to others. So practice with yourself first, and then begin to sort of rest and pause so that you're strengthened and nourished in the ways that will make our prayer and our advocacy and our sincere dua sustainable.
I mean, beautiful. Thank you so much, Chaplain Sondos. Anything you want to add? Hafizakum Allah. Thank you to you both. This was amazing. For those watching, for those who are going to watch this recording, I have a tip for you. I would rewatch this. There were so many amazing themes that I do feel need some time to kind of percolate. And I felt like I grew from this conversation, as I'm sure a lot of you have felt as well. So definitely rewatch this. Thank you to Yasmin and the Bayan team for setting this up. And inshallah, you all have a great rest of your evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum salam. Jazakumullah khair.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.